All right, this is Hyperborean Radio coming at you straight from the wasteland of modernity. Celtic God speaking here, and with me is the Lore Keeper. How you doing?
I'm doing well, and let's get started today.
All right, so one of the things that we wanted to go over today is there might be some concerns that we're no longer a pagan channel. Well, this isn't true. We are as much of a pagan-oriented channel as we've always been. Now, we refer to the wild folk, the wild people, to differentiate because we want to actually orient on the nature of our people more specifically than any particular details. So everything that we talk about is oriented around getting to know who we are as a people. And then, but you guys have been doing these silly little shorts, which we do have a couple little shorts out there, and I hope that you guys enjoy those. But this is to show that we're developing new skills. We're planning on bringing more content, I guess. It's more content, but actually more varied content to our show, so that we can bring in new listeners and allow people to have just a little bit of fun, because we need to have a little bit of fun. So yeah, that's why the shorts, that's why some of the funny little things that we've been doing. And also on YouTube, there's this interesting thing that there's just certain things that we can't talk about. So then why are we doing shows on YouTube? Well, it's point blank, it's for the reach. You can jump in at any time if you got something to add on to this.
Well, and it's something we've actually talked about before, because you mentioned that we use terms like the wild folk, the wild way. And it's basically shorthand or modern terminology for, ethnic faith. There's dozens of names for people that originally practiced European ethnic faith. There's heathen, pagan, probably some people threw around heretic, goodfellow, fae, elves. Yeah, they actually called old school wild folk the fae and the elves. And in the modern day, the term effectively means so many different things that it's lost meaning. So pagan, and I even once actually did a whole video on this subject. There are many, many different types of pagan, because pagan effectively just means non-Abrahamic. So a Satanist is pagan, an occultist is pagan, a Hindu is pagan, a Mesopotamian ethnic faith is pagan. It doesn't refer to a specific category.
Right, and so we wanted to make it very clear that we're differentiated from these. So we decided to focus on the wild part because it has multiple connotations, and we like old things, so we spell it the old way with the Y instead of the I. Why? Because it's cool. So yeah, there's a lot of different things. We're doing a lot of different projects, because I know some people are bummed that we haven't been doing live streams like we used to. Instead, we're doing these recordings and then putting these out. And they're going out on Sundays. But there is a reason for that, and that is because we are so few people with our fingers in so many pies, and there's to be blunt, there's only so many hours in a day, and then there's scheduling conflicts, and so this is the easiest way that we could figure out how to do it.
Well, and it's sort of, you use the analogy of two men, or whatever the actual term is. I'm terrible at differentiating between those, but our fingers are in too many pies. So I guess the thing is, we can make a lot of banana cream, or we can make a variety of various pies. So for people that like the podcast, it's still here, but instead of, 24, 30, 40 hours a week devoted to making banana cream pie, we're only devoting 8 to 10 hours, maybe like 15, depending on how detailed we want to get into it. And allowing us to focus more on books and other projects, as well as sort of laying the groundwork for the broader goals that we've spoken about before. And I think this actually ties into the title of today's show, The Post-Apocalyptic Fairytale, which is a playful, it's a play on words effectively, because I noticed that most people, ourselves included to a certain extent, the sort of idea that we talk about is, yeah, everything seems like it's going to collapse eventually. There's this downward trend, but there's so much potential after that. It's like one of the things I often say: don't focus on the decay so much that you ignore the saplings at your feet.
Right, exactly. And that's exactly where I was going to go with it. Is some people, they see the decay of society and civilization and, oh, it's the end, but it's not the end. It is a beginning. It is a potential beginning where we can potentially build back better, as the government likes to say. Hey, I mean, they're paying for the advertisement for that phrase. We might as well use it too. But we can build back better, and reintroduce our very own nature, the nature of our people back to our people. So, and that's why the post-apocalyptic fairy tale, where we got the apocalyptic, the shootouts in that one short, and just basically playing with sounds and having fun with it. Because it's not the end. It's actually just a beginning. And if we take advantage of it, we can build something great. We can build something fantastic. And yeah, we're working on a lot of different projects right now. Children's books. We got the God of the Day book that we're working on another magazine. So we're doing a lot of different things. And to make room to do those things, the live streams, we've put them to the side for now. And we do 2 of these recordings a week. We missed last week, 4th of July. Stuff happened. We got the one up for the YouTube, but we missed the one on the podcast. So we have our super secret broadcast that goes out on all the podcast platforms out there, and it's under the same name, Hyperborean Radio. So I hope that you guys catch those, and sometimes they'll be related to what we talk about on YouTube, but I mean, really, I know our nature. They're going to go off in another direction, and they'll be very different.
Well, and for anyone that's stuck around since before we were called Hyperborean Radio, the name change was for a variety of reasons, but one of the big ones is neither of us are actually Norse pagans, and Heimdall is an explicitly Scandinavian deity. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of people showing up that were kind of surprised that we weren't Asatru, basically. And I think that Hyperborean Radio, because it encompasses both the aesthetic we're kind of trying to go for with both what we're pitching as well as what this is, what we talk about, but also Hyperborean, it's the term we use to refer to our people. It means the people of the North. And the reason that we picked that is it's more accurate. We're not trying to specify that we are this type of pagan. Like if you asked, CG is more Celtic and I'm more Germanic, specifically more on the Southern German side, but we both have studied the whole breadth of it. And we're more interested in looking at it to find our own nature and how things seem to be done than trying to push a specific pantheon in a religious fervor.
And while we are on many platforms, podcast platforms, that's actually through Anchor.fm. It's our only sponsor currently. So anybody that listens to our podcast, we really appreciate it. It does allow us to inch forward. So we really do appreciate that. And really, we don't fly by that might seem like it, but we don't fly by the seat of our pants on this show. There is a lot of research that goes into this, a lot of buying books, a lot of paying on websites for access to research that only serious researchers get access to. Their equipment, I'm sure everybody's noticed since the transition to Hyperborean Radio, the sound quality has become, while not excellent, significantly better. And that's due to equipment that we got. And there's a lot of things. We're learning new skills, getting new equipment. There's a lot of things that we want to do, and we've learned the hard way to not talk about things that's too far out of reach at the moment. So there's some things that we're working on currently we won't mention for a year, maybe two.
Well, because like we mentioned a while ago, and this will probably be the last time I mention it before we actually get really close to the goal, which is that we're hoping to start basically a town. However, we had some people who thought we already had it, even though we never claimed that. And that was an interesting misunderstanding. And as a result, we've noticed that if you talk about something, people either assume you've already done it or are actively in the middle of working on it rather than towards it. And people can't differentiate between towards and on. Towards means you're walking the steps to the next floor where you can do the thing, whereas on means you're already on that floor, basically. And a lot of what we do are the steps to get to the next floor, I guess is how I would, use it as an imagery there.
Yeah, and so a lot of the imagery that we're putting out there, or beginning to put out there, like the post-apocalyptic thing, it's actually to bring hope and to inspire our people to dream of, yes, we know things are not good right now. However, if we step up, we can take advantage of it, and we can actually, I'm going to use it again, build back better. I love it. Thank you, American government, for just just pumping that out there. Because it's true, though. They're using it in a weird, twisted way. And from their perspective, they're probably telling the truth. But that doesn't mean that we can't build back better in our own way.
Well, it's one of those things people often will use. They'll have a good idea, but they'll do it in a weird way. And one of those most notable ones is actually one thing I found out about recently, because I'm a bit of a fan of like the steampunk genre and things like that. One thing I found out recently was something called solar punk, which is, it has a lot of things lining up with what we talk about, except it's been mostly bogarted by the more pink-haired persuasion of people. And we will not push that. If you haven't noticed with the Wild Way, the Wild Folk, we're more interested in things that are closer to not only our nature, but nature period. And one of the prime faults that most people seem to have with solar punk is this: while they want to work with nature, they're also trying to abandon certain rules of nature, like pack first, or the ability of any sort of in-group preference or anything. And it's just odd that people are trying to... It's like we've said before. If you're going to do something, don't start at the point right before it collapses. Some people want to try and build like an adjacent economy. You don't do that by starting out by getting a bunch of Fortune 500 companies or something on there. You start with, hey, Mr. Rogers, my neighbor, here's a jar of blueberries. And you build enough trust that people are doing that, and then you can build from there. Otherwise, everything just becomes a commodity. There's no aspect there of actually doing it.
Right, and some people might be thinking, well, you guys are a bunch of Luddites. Well, this also isn't true. We're just talking about getting back closer to nature. It's not about subduing nature. It's not about walking away from away from technology, period, etc. Because I don't know, if you want to dig a hole, a shovel is nice, and a shovel is technology.
Well, and that's why I brought up solar punk, because it is about going back to nature, but it's not about some pseudo caveman thing that I think some people try to paint certain ideas as. You'd still be able to keep that electrical knowledge, technological knowledge. It's just about, that's not the main thing. There's not this blind pursuance of technology for technology's sake. I mean, like in the United States, for instance, I don't know how far this spread, but fidget spinners. I don't remember how many people remember the fidget spinner craze from like a few years ago, but everyone was obsessed with frickin' fidget spinners. I still don't know what the frick they were. But for like half a year, everyone freaking had one, and then they just basically stopped existing. Like, people just stopped caring. And this is it's nothing new for there to be a trend, but for an entire industry to be built, die, and then disappear within less than a year because of a fad, it's a bit odd. And it's one of those things where technologically, advancement is good, but is it always something that you want? It's like, as much as it might get us in trouble on YouTube, does everyone need the new iPhone every year, or however often they put it out, where there are barely any improvements and it's effectively just the same phone?
But basically, yeah, we're still the same people with the same views. We're just presenting things in a slightly different way, hopefully a little bit more fun way, a way that will inspire imagination and a little bit of hope. We're not bringing a bucket full of a phrase I've recently come aware of. We're not bringing buckets full of hopium, but we're also not bringing, a wheelbarrow full of black pills. So it's somewhere in that middle area.
Well, we always try to pursue balance, and not in the hippy dippy way, but in an actual way. We don't try to be too far in one direction or the other. I'm not interested in completely doing away with the achievements of the past, but I'm also not interested in continuing blindly down a clearly damaging path. And that's something that I think can end up being confusing.
Right, and the general idea is to take the best from the past, build to the future, leave the worst of it behind, hopefully, and at least make completely different mistakes. And we still advocate for homeschooling, building physical communities that may include towns, but it could also be as simple as knowing who your neighbor is, or I don't know, developing a play group for your kids at the park.
Well, and I think one of the reasons that we decided to go with the sort of post-apocalyptic fairy tale as the conception of all of this is precisely that. Is regardless of how you view it, we are effectively living in a dystopia now. So even if you somehow switched away from it being a dystopia, that's still the end of one thing and the beginning of another. And there's this consistent thing where nobody's really happy that things are the way they are currently. There is a desire for change across the board. The only people that want things to stay the same are people that are either being able to significantly profit off the current situation, or people that were so comfortable beforehand that they still haven't fully perceived the changes that are going on in the world.
Right, and we're not going to focus on the negatives of things. We are as aware as everybody out there of everything that's not fair, it's not right, and it's easy to fall into that trap and just focus on that. But we're opting to not do that. And yes, we are aware. We're aware of this movement and that movement and all the hurdles that we face and the attacks that we're coming under. But we're also aware of opportunities to push past this. And if really our general approach is yes.
I was just going to say that one thing is, once you're kind of on this side of the internet, there is this conception that there are certain things you have to talk about, and then if you're not talking about them, you're somehow unaware of them. And I think this is a very foolish conception, because then everything becomes tied into these subjects and there's never any release. Like, why did we start framing things through these stories, through these conceptions, through this aesthetic, through all these things? It's because we wanted our audience as well to have fun. We wanted to have fun. We wanted you guys to have fun. We're not interested in being downers. We're not interested in making you have a bummer or anything.
Right. Well, and we spend so much of our day angry. Why? What good does it do us to just be angry all the time? Yes.
Well, you're allowed to like stuff. You're allowed to enjoy things. Just because things are bad doesn't mean you can't have fun. It doesn't mean you can't enjoy. The fact that someone's not angry all the time is not indicative of their lack of awareness. If anything, it's a ability of self-control.
Yeah. And again, if we have noticed, it's not just us, because we've gone through this state too, where just angry all the time and just dwelling on everything that makes us angry and just basically living in that space. And we've noticed nothing really gets done. I mean, you feel better because you're complaining about it, because you're angry and but that's it. Nothing else happens. And if we don't want to dwell in that place, because we need to start making steps forward. And if we're just angry all the time, we are too angry to actually do something. This does not mean that we don't care. It just means, yes, this is not good. And we are going to work to build something so that this is no longer an issue. So that's why we're not just going to sit here. Like, these are some big channels that do this. They just sit there and for an hour or two, some of them every day, they just complain about everything. That's all that they do, is just complain and rage, and it feels good, and people like to participate in that. But what about the building part? What about the, hey, this sucks, why are we still participating in this? So yeah, we're looking at actually doing something about it, and it's slow going because there's very few of us, but we're working on it constantly.
Well, and it's sort of, there's a couple things we've talked about in the past, and one of them is what versus why. And a lot of people, when you ask someone why they're doing something, especially if it's something that has triggered a lot of anger, instead of describing why they do it, they actually are more likely to say what they're doing again, what they're acting against. And I think this is a very, very untenable position for anyone to be in, whether you're a baker or a more significant job, say in government or a corporation, because it's a reactive state, and it's one largely based on anger. And what we're more interested in is both the why, but also who and how. Like, how do you fix things? Why would you fix things? Why are these things the way you do? The actual core, the nature of it. Some people have said we're not really a pagan channel. And if you're looking for somebody who is going to endlessly talk up the Norse gods or the Roman gods and not go into further distinctions, maybe. I mean,
right. Well, and there's been people that said that, and they're like, well, you guys never talk about ritual. I mean, really, how do you herald the gods? Which feathers do you shake, and which candles do you light, and which bowls, and what hymns do you hum? What? Our rituals include things like, I don't know, going for walks to keep the health up, or to get the health up, lifting weights, training hand-to-hand combat, training ranged combat, doing research. These are our rituals, and they actually accomplish something. This show would not exist if we just focused on a ritual to do the show. We could get the fanciest bowl with the bestest blood and the brightest fire and some incense sticks and light those and wave feathers around while going hi-ya, 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 hum, Freya. And that would not make the show exist. So our rituals are actually doing things. I mean, if we had the space, yeah, there'd be a garden. And we're going to work on using what space we do have. Currently, right now, we have let's call it a small studio. We have a studio that we work from. This is our ritual. Organize the studio so that we can do these shows, that we can perform our research. We can do the writing and the talking and all this stuff. How is that any less pagan than using a ritual bowl with some ritual salt, with ritual chalk, with ritual song? Is actually doing something any less pagan?
Well, and yeah, I'm got a brain fart. Here you go.
But yeah, and we've got a couple shelves worth of books. We are aware of what's going on in the world. I spend a couple hours every day going through current events, so through the news. I follow politics so that I know what's coming up, what moves are being made before they're made. We are aware of these things, but does it do us or you any good to talk about that nonstop when there's a lot of channels out there that do that?
Well, and really, this is about as much of talking about this kind of stuff as we should be doing. I don't really want to go into these subjects because it has nothing to do with what we're trying to do. It doesn't. I mean, everything has something to do with everything. It's like that. Like, everything is inherently political. If you buy red onions instead of white onions, it's going to become political somehow. But I'm uninterested in playing into that either way.
Right. And I mean, it's pretty bad when a political situation has become, or a apolitical stance has itself become a political stance. What? So yeah, basically it does us no good. It doesn't help you understand, well, why does my feelings get hurt when this thing happens? Why do I feel good when this thing happens? Why is that person over there doing that really weird thing that doesn't make any sense? Instead, we like to focus on the why. Like, how many people out there talk about how our people, the Hyperborean people, everything that we do is oriented around being the good guy. We want to be the good guy. We want to be the hero. We all try to be the hero of our own story, no matter, there's nobody that wakes up in the morning and twists their beard and steeples their fingers and says, ha 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 ha, however shall I screw over my own people this day? That guy doesn't exist. So yeah, it doesn't do any good, so we don't focus there. This is the last time really that I'm going to be bringing that up. Instead, we'll focus on our people. How many other channels out there will bring up the concept of convergent evolution? That's something else that we talk about quite a bit, is the idea of convergent evolution versus divergent evolution. We bring up how dangerous universalism is to our people, period. And not just our people, but all people. Yeah, it's these things are just not talked about, and that's what we prefer to talk about so that people can understand the why. Why are people drawn to these universalist ideas? Why is a more tribalistic view healthier? And so on and so on.
Well, it's like I was mentioning earlier, people that want to get back to nature, but they'll ignore aspects of nature. Wolf packs don't get along. Bears have territory. It's one of those things where you can... I do think one of the most important things people can do, and this is going to be a slight change of topic about where I was headed, is you have to believe that things can get better, and you have to envision a world that is better and work towards that. And I know that our vision, my vision, CG's vision, everyone's vision is going to differ a little bit, but if we all think of something better, we might be able to head in that direction. And I think constantly focusing on how things are now, well, it's a little pointless in reality. Not because you shouldn't be concerned, not because you shouldn't act, not because you shouldn't understand what's going on, but because dwelling on it constantly will do you, will do me, will do CG no good.
Right, and we're not trying to advocate for forcing people into doing anything in particular. So, like, if you really love living in an urban area, first I'm going to wonder why, but hey, fine, whatever. We're not trying to force you out of the urban area, away from all the technology, into the rural countryside. We're trying to open up options. Why should the people that prefer a rural life be forced to live like the people that live in urban areas?
Well, it's something I've brought up before. Why should, say, people who are perfectly happy living a life as basically nomads, I don't know, reindeer nomads like the Sami or something like that, why in the world should they be forced to have to deal to come into modernity? There's this sort of idea that's gone around, and it's fairly common, especially in our home country, the United States, that the way things are done now is not only the best, but it's something everyone should do. You know, the way that the political systems run, the way that the environmental systems are run, the way the cities are set up. There's this idea that this is the ideal, and therefore it should be something everyone does. And it ignores so much variety within nature, within the way people choose to act. Some people might prefer to be hunter-gatherers. Some people might prefer to be Wall Street executives. You don't know. But there's no reason everyone should be forced to exist within a certain paradigm. In fact, it creates fragility. I know this is a bit of a buzzword, but anti-fragility gives you options. It means if one breaks, say, city collapses, the rural, the nomads, the hunter-gatherers, the, I don't know, fishing pirates, whatever you want to, however wild you want to get, there are options. If one fails, that doesn't mean all of them fail.
Right. Well, and just as an example, I have utterly terrified some people because I pointed out to them just how fragile today's system is by bringing up the Carrington event. And they're like, the Carrington event? What's that? For anybody out there in the audience that doesn't know, the Carrington event is if you Google it up real quick, it's a giant solar flare. And there's already been a solar flare of this magnitude that has struck the Earth actually many times in the past. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. But it would cause an EMP pulse, or that's the P part of the EMP. But it'd cause an electromagnetic pulse that would surround the Earth, frying out all the electrical systems. And then I explained to these people just how reliant we are on electricity. Like odds are your car wouldn't start. The ability to stop making, or the ability to make fuel would stop. Refrigeration would stop. So transportation, refrigeration, and those things would just stop. And water would stop because most water pumps are pumped off from electricity. And watching the realization of just how fragile the current system is wash over these people, it was actually kind of frightening to watch.
Well, and along with that, because pretty much everything's fragile. All you need to sink a boat is one hole big enough that they can't plug. And that's part of it. Or even just remove the rudder. I mean, they won't sink, but they won't be going anywhere.
Well, they won't steer.
They won't steer, which is effectively the same thing, all things considered, depending on where you are.
Definitely not naval, but yes.
No, I know. There's differences. I know I'm a landlubber, so for anybody who is seafaring, I know I said something very, very wrong. But my point that I'm trying to get to is something that is a part of, I think, part of the problem is, I'm going to read a quote here from Gilles Deleuze, I think is how it's pronounced, but discussion is just an exercise in narcissism where everyone takes turns showing off. Very quickly, you no longer have any idea what is being discussed. And I'll admit, there are times that I've done that, where I'm either too angry or too unattentive or something like that, where I'm just really, neither of us, me or whoever I'm talking to, is having an actual conversation. And I think the internet has sped this up because people have created this absolutist, you either agree with me 100% or you and I cannot be friends. And I think this has created a very unhealthy system of people's interaction.
Right. And this is something that I've noticed is a lot of times if you speak against, forced technology, forcing people to accept all this technology, it's all of it or none of it, then all of a sudden they will place you in this camp of you are completely against technology. And that is not necessarily the truth either. We live in this weird paradigm of all or nothing, which is actually reflective of our people and our natures, but it is not good for discussion.
Well, it's like I can not really drive, back when I lived in Iowa, I used to bike and walk to a lot of places because the area I lived in had that option. I preferred that because I'd rather be outside. I'd rather say hello to my neighbors. I'd rather, go through the woods rather than the concrete streets. And if I had the option, I would rather do that all the time. But some people might take that as I'm super anti-car and I want to pop all the tires and force everyone to walk because, hey, I prefer to walk. I prefer to bike. I prefer to actually experience things around me rather than just drive everywhere. It changed a little bit when I moved up to Michigan because most places aren't as walkable as they were back in my hometown. So I drive a lot more now. I still hold the opinion that I'd like things to be walkable. I'd like things to be relatively easy to access that way. But I also understand the reality of how most things are set up. A lot of people would take the fact that I have the opinion of things should be walkable as anti-car. And it's actually reflective of our people. We're a people of extremes. And the ethnic faith that we have is typically designed to, if you think about it, balance those extremes out. And with this nature that we have, it's created this, you're either against us or you're with us. All these battle lines have been drawn, and it goes down to singular individuals. The churches of one that are very common right now among Christianity because a lot of people want to stay Christian, and then they do a bunch of research and they come up with this relatively convoluted idea by piecing together, cherry picking their own options from different forms of Christianity and forming their own version. And they become a church of one. And this is the same in paganism. And I've told people before, I don't really care if you're into extreme esoteric symbolism and stuff, but I am not the person to talk to about it because I really don't care. And it's the weirdest thing because I'll get into a conversation with them and I'll try to just be talking about stories or even just how their day was. And it eventually devolves into them saying a bunch of cryptic, esoteric stuff and questioning how dare I not know these things or why can I not know these things. And in some cases I do know the things, I just really don't care. And it's gotten to the point where I think people are having trouble communicating because there's so many different views of it. And I'm not going to say that any of them are wrong. I'm just going to say that they're not the same. It's why we decided to go with the wild folk, the wilder folk, the wild way, is because that's our focus. We're more focused in the nature of our people and how that reflects through our native spirituality, traditions, cultures, customs, what have you, than trying to craft a religion or an esoteric tradition.
Well, in short, a lot of that other stuff, it focuses on death aspect. A lot of it is actually cultish of death, as in the sense of they're focusing on after living part, where we like to focus on the living part because it's important. It's because we are alive. There's entire cults out there. Of Abraham is some of the most notable. So is the Dravidian religions such as Hinduism. They like to focus on the afterlife, on the other realms. Well, we don't live there. We live here in this realm. So we honestly, we prefer to focus on the living part. It's not that the other isn't important at all. It's just, why are we focusing on after we die while we're still alive? It doesn't make any sense, because then if that's the case, why is exercising important? It becomes not important if you focus on the afterlife. I'll just simplify it. You focus on the afterlife, exercising, and this life actually becomes detrimental, because then you're going to live longer. Life is not something to escape, which is why we focus on the living part. Life is something to cherish and to exalt in. Now, the other thing is we like to focus on quality of life over quantity of life. So, and it's backed up historically that the wild people have always been like that. Quality over quantity, focusing on the living part of it. Everything that we talk about is historically validated, and we also reference some famous would they be philosophers or psychologists, like young Nietzsche, for instance. I guess philosophers is probably closer, but the fraud Freud, no.
Well, and just to give an example of how me and CG can sometimes disagree, because you were talking about how all these other things are focused on death and paganism is more focused on life. I would actually argue yes and no, because what the other faiths are focused on is actually life after death. Mm-hmm. It's not the now. It's what you can get later. Mm-hmm. That's what people are desiring. It's not the death part they're focused on. If it was just the death part, they wouldn't fear death so much. Mm-hmm. They would actually welcome it, which they don't. They don't even face it head on with bravery on average. What it is, I think, is because it's actually something we've noticed, actual cults of death, they're not goth and, let's drink blood and all this other weird shit that's spawned out of pop culture. It's when you venerate death, you are actually venerating life, because you know that it will eventually end, and therefore you have to do everything in your power to actually make the most of it. And in paganism, we have a lot of death gods, a lot of them. And, like the Morrigan, for instance, or Hell, or many of these, or the Grim Reaper, these aren't deities to fear, though some people might treat them like that. We understand that eventually we will die, but we're here now and we're going to live the best, because what people want is this theoretical better life after death. In some cases, that's heaven or whatever they're called, nirvana, or anything, or reincarnated as a king in India or what have you. We're not arguing for that. We're arguing that yes, there could be many different types of afterlives. Halls, the Meadows of the Ancestor, Davy Jones' Locker. There's many different ones throughout the folklore and myth. But in the end, the main thing we know is we're here now and we need to make the most of it. We need to be the best version we can be.
Right, and a lot of these, because you call these Christians very esoteric, as you said, focusing on the afterlife. There's one thing that they all have in common. They actually do fear death. And why? I've met several people that was dying on their deathbed. They never regretted what they did so much. There's always the oddball. They'll be like, "Oh, I regret doing this," but by and large, it's I regret not doing this. I regret not doing that other thing. I regret not hugging my daughter. I regret not telling my son that he did a good job. I regret not building that house with my uncle. Whatever it is, that's where the regrets lay. And why do they have those regrets? Is because they lived in fear. They lived in fear of what if. They lived in fear of, well, how will this affect my afterlife? You see where I'm going with it. You have to see where I'm going with it. If you focus on the living part, you acknowledge the death. So because the common vernacular is that we are death cultists. I guess, technically, because we have all these death deities. However, because of that, we focus on the living part. Once you live, and you actually live, what is there left to fear? There's nothing left to fear.
Well, with our way of doing things, I think. Well, I'll actually just say this because this is actually what I wanted to say. I finally remembered it. Fun fact, in the lore, and this is both Christian and pagan. It's actually part of like the Christians trying to vilify the pagans or whatever. If you are unbaptized, this is actually written in or unreligious or whatever, your soul belongs to the heathen gods. And here's a beautiful thing is baptism doesn't count if you don't get it willingly. During COVID, a big thing was the priests using a squirt gun of holy water to baptize babies because they couldn't touch them with COVID. So, and this is the thing. Even though that's ridiculous, that's effectively what happens. The baby has no idea what's going on. So there's no covenant there. There's nothing there. The whole thing is invalid. That's why there's certain sects of Christianity that do adult baptism.
Well, and it's not just the act of getting baptized while you're an adult either. It's, and this is in the Christian lore, you have to believe it. You have to want it. You have to accept it. If you don't, all they did was get you wet.
Like the scene with Rollo in Vikings. You know, he's like, one of you must be baptized. And Rollo's like, fine, I'll do it. And then they get him wet and the priest, and he's just like, just get away from me, priest. I did your thing. And again, we don't push the Vikings TV show as somehow accurate, but it's it's something that happened in pop culture that you might know of. And that's the thing, is I don't know anybody that's actually brought that up, aside from us, that bit of lore.
Or our connection to the bears. Okay, so one race, the human race, there's actually a lot of scientific exploration, I guess, study. It supports convergent evolution as much as divergent evolution.
Well, and it's one of those things that was never disproven. It just fell out of fashion to talk about it. For example, and again, this is probably the only one we're really going to get political on because I really want to avoid retouching these subjects. Even on the podcast, really, I'd like to more talk about what we want to do rather than why we're doing this sort of thing, which seems contradictory to earlier. But anyway, there's actually another, it was a psychological thing that was swept under the rug, but it was never disproven, which is homosexuality as a mental illness. And I'm not trying to be political here. It just was legitimately never disproven. I mean, one way or the other. So in other words, legally, it's still technically classified as that because it was never disproven. It was never removed. It just stopped being talked about because it lost any sort of cultural relevance because nobody would work with that.
Right. So we have changed our formatting. Part of it is the platform that we're on. YouTube, there's just certain things that we really cannot go into detail on. So that's why the super secret radio broadcasts on various podcast platforms. There's the idea that we need to encourage our people, that's you, dear listeners, the Hyperboreans out there, and even other purebreds, to be honest. We view them as other species, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily have to hate them. I don't know, squirrels just because they're squirrels. Yeah, they're squirrels. Anyways, it's, I forgot where I was going with it. Do you happen to remember where I was going with this? No. Yeah, monitoring too many things. My brain skipped gears. But yeah, there's this whole thing where our presentation has changed, but our views have not. And it's important for our people to remember to have fun, to dream, to work towards those dreams, because we need doers, we do need dreamers, but we also need doers. We need the doers that can build the dreams, whether it's their own dreams or the collective dream that a particular group might have. One group of Hyperboreans might want to bring our wild nature to a more urban environment because they like the universities and the museums, which they're wonderful. They can be. I mean, currently they're not, but they could be. These are like our temples, really, if you think about it. They're temples to knowledge. They're temples to the past. So, or theater. And most of these things actually only really occur on any scale in urban environments.
Well, one thing we do talk about is what was the Temple of Asclepius? It was a hospital, or what we would call a hospital. And that's the thing is, temples to deities weren't just magical buildings you went and did a thing. They weren't church. They were active buildings. It's just, what was the value of this? You know, it would be more apt for a god of trading to be present in a market than it would be for the temple to just be a fancy building with a statue in it. It's like what was Vesta's whole thing. It was a place for the eternal flame. What was Asclepius? It was the hospitals. What about, Pan? He had, giant groves because he's a god of the wild. And honestly, all the gods had groves. There's even myths of, like Demeter, she had a sacred grove. Some rich asshole comes in, starts cutting the trees down because it's on his land. Demeter gets revenge. It's a whole thing. These groves, and this is actually what I push. Regrow the sacred groves. I don't truly care about the temple. You want a temple? Go to a nice library, stick a Minerva statue in there. There's a place that people go to spin, like a spinning room. I don't know if those still exist, but you can throw a statue of Frigg or the Norns in there. Really, the idea of just building a place whose sole purpose is this religiosity, I think is just odd. I'm not going to say like Notre Dame or any of these pretty buildings we made that are for a foreign faith were not beautiful, and in many cases chock full of pagan imagery that the builders snuck in. But there's a whole context there, and I think it would be far better both environmentally, spiritually, culturally, to bring the idea of sacred groves back. And we even sort of have that in America with like the national parks, but it's been completely warped. But there's even a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. A grove of redwoods or sequoias should be kept just as if we would keep a beautiful cathedral. And I think that's very telling of the spirit coming through, even in a time when the ethnic faith of our people was seen as being largely undone.
Yeah. So again, our views haven't changed. The way that we're presenting them are, we're trying to have a little bit more fun, playing with sounds. Maybe eventually we'll do full-on radio plays. And the reason is radio plays are very well, even our TV, and we're going to draw all kinds of comparisons. TV shows, movies, etc. These things are hand-me-downs, or they're descended from some of our traditions, the oral tradition, the oral stories, and radio plays are actually pretty close to that. So we might develop entire radio plays around particular concepts. We're still developing things, and currently right now we're doing 1-minute ones because they're what we're capable of at the moment as we develop the skills, but these things might open up. Hopefully you guys enjoy them. If you do, let us know. If you absolutely hate them and would rather us just talk, go ahead and say that too. Doesn't mean that we'll listen, but you can say it. But yeah, eventually, with the presentation here that we're doing for YouTube, these ones probably a little less sound because there's visual, which we're also working on other visual stuff, figuring out how to do things, sometimes we need, for some things we need more equipment, so on and so forth. For the podcast, which is different, it's same topic, different presentation, completely different show. So don't think just because you listen to the YouTube podcast that you already listened to the podcast version of it, because they are two completely different things. And we're also separating them because we noticed if we post them both on the same day, on Sunday, people will listen to one or the other, but not to both of them. And I'm guessing it's because they thought they was the same show. So we're going to spread them out, one on Sunday, the other one probably on Wednesday. And I'm figuring keep the YouTube version on Sunday and then move the podcast version over to Wednesdays. And it gives us a little bit more wiggle room too, and by and large also nearly guarantees that we'll be talking about a completely different subject, because over there we don't have to watch out for the YouTube overlords. So on that note, because we're really close to the end, I'm going to wrap this up and remind everybody to always be brave. Be brave in everything that you do, and things will get better.
And I'll finish up by telling people you're allowed to like stuff and try to have some fun. I know that can be hard at times, but really, all work and no play make Jack a dull boy, and all play and no work makes Jack a mere toy. Have a good day, everybody. Lorky Brout.